So while everyone fills in, I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes or just maybe about a minute or so for the room to fill up while I see the number trickling up, which is also exciting to see it trickle up so fast. And thanks everyone for making the time to attend and to speak to everyone. I really appreciate it. Okay, it'll probably be a little bit like while everyone fills in, but I started to see the number trickle up a little less quickly now. So first, I just want to thank everyone for being here and for making time for this. One of the most exciting things for me was that I saw the registration list was really bipartisan, and I'm so thankful that people on both sides of the aisle were interested in hearing about this. People in industry, people in politics. So first, I'll let you know who I am. I'm Shoshana Weissmann, the head of digital media and a policy fellow at the R Street Institute. So I head all our digital media, and then I work on regulatory policy, which is kind of how my tech regulatory stuff came to be. And today's event is about how social media platforms can best report the ways in which governments all over the world, including our own, regularly ask social media platforms to remove, hide, maintain, and disclose content. The requests are sometimes fully legitimate, and other times they may be abuses of power. There's a lot of layers to this question, and I'm so thankful to have the perfect panel of experts to work through these layers with me. I'm also extremely honored that Senator Cynthia Lummis made time for us today to keynote the event. While I want to introduce her, I want to say that I really love Wyoming. I'm a big fan of the Wind River Range. Even though I've never been there, I'm hopefully going to make it out there in the next couple of years, and not just to High Point. And I love the Tetons. I've been there 3 times already, so I wanted to make sure to mention that. I will always plug my hiking adventures and how wonderful Wyoming is there and all the moose I've seen there. And now on to Senator Lummis. She's the first woman to serve as the United States Senator from Wyoming. She has spent her life serving and working in Wyoming, including spending time operating her family's cattle ranches. Which I wonder if I passed while I've been in Wyoming. She served in the U.S. House from 2009 to 2017 and in the Senate since 2021. During her tenure, she has focused heavily on issues including reining in spending and reducing the federal deficit, keeping public lands open to the public and available for multiple uses, and fighting for pro-innovation technology policy, which is why we're particularly so honored that she made time to speak to us today. So Senator Lummis, whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be with you. Thanks for the invitation from R Street. I have a cold and laryngitis, so if you struggle to hear me, I apologize for that. You know, we're without a doubt in an unprecedented time in history as it pertains to freedom of speech and the manner in which governments interact and regulate that speech. So we're seeing in real time the failures of government when it comes to interacting with companies that provide platforms for speech on the internet. Recently, the Twitter files illustrated that all too clearly. So in my view, Congress has 2 options. We can reform Section 230, which is discussed a lot around here on Capitol Hill, or create more stringent requirements for transparency around government moderation requests. And at this juncture, increasing transparency with regard to government requests for content moderation does seem to be the best move. If the White House is going to request that, for example, Twitter remove policy-related content from its platform, Twitter users should know about it. So I co-sponsored the Preserve Online Speech Act in 2021, which would require that tech companies publicly disclose moderation requests received from government agencies. Now, there's similar potential for legislation in the 118th Congress, the one that just started. Americans use social media to keep up with current events, friends, family, but we've seen the misuse and misinformation spread in harmful ways. matters that we need to address. The government needs to be very careful about how they wade into regulating social media platforms so as not to stifle free speech, but that's not an excuse for taking no action at all. I'm also concerned that all too often, moderation action is directed at conservative accounts. Any government requested content moderation should be politically neutral. So that's kind of the way that I'd like to kick off this discussion. You know, I, as a person, for example, who watched content regarding COVID vaccinations and information about COVID, have its content moderated in ways that excluded the voices, such as Dr. Robert Malone, who was the mRNA inventor, and who want people to know that while waiting for vaccines like Pfizer and Moderna, there were alternatives that were efficacious. Ivermectin, D3 vitamins, along with zinc and vitamin C, were really making a difference for people. But that content moderation that the government imposed didn't allow those messages to get through to people who really needed treatment options. And this is just one example of where I think when the government gets involved in moderating content, especially content that provides information as opposed to spreading misinformation and hatred, is something that government should not be disallowed. So it's time that we know, as Americans, if our government is imposing content restrictions, that be disclosed to the people who are subject to those restrictions. The content moderation can come from either government disclosure or from the tech companies who have received requests for content disclosure moderation. But it's got to come from somebody. So thank you very much for letting me kick off your discussion. You've got a great panel, and I appreciate being invited to participate.
Thank you so much, Senator, and for making time while you have laryngitis. That's a big ask, and we really can't thank you enough for your remarks and for your continued interest and work on this issue. Especially because it's funny, while I'd planned this event prior to the Twitter files, once that came out, I was like, oh man, this worked out pretty well.
Relevant topic, and we're desperately in need of conversation, input, sharing ideas. We really appreciate your involvement as well.
Thank you so much. That was really exciting, and I'm so thankful to have had the senator here. And now I'll jump into our panel. To start, we have Neil Chilson, who's Senior Research Fellow for Technology and Innovation at Stand Together. We have Kaitlin Sullivan, Director of Content Policy at Meta. And we have Emma Llansó, Director of the Free Expression Project for the Center for Democracy and Technology. And this isn't just a great panel of like really smart experts and stuff. This was actually exactly who I wanted for this. And I got really, really lucky from the senator to the panel that I got everyone. And I'll explain why now. So this actually started from one of Neil's tweets. He had tweeted a couple of months ago, starting ASAP, Elon Musk should require Twitter staff to record all requests for content moderation or user discipline from governments or government officials. This info should be publicly released in periodic reports like the ones platforms do for law enforcement requests. So after that, I forgot if it was Kaitlin or me who jumped in, and I was like, yeah, we should do that. But Kaitlin was like, wait a sec, there's barriers here. And it's not just like the logistics, there's lots of stuff going on here. And I was like, wow, there's so much here I didn't think of, because I'm like, why don't we just disclose everything? So now I'd like, oh, and I also wanted to mention with Emma, some of her experience is definitely a little bit more human rights based than ours. It's more, that as the first focus, which is really exciting. to be able to have that in addition to everything. And I also just have been a big fan of Center for Democracy and Technology's work for a long time. And getting to talk to Emma in particular here is really exciting for me as just, your general nerd. But I'll start with Kaitlin first, and then I'll go to Neil and then Emma. But I'd like each of you to talk just briefly about some of your background and experience here, some of your basic thoughts here, and where you come from, and then we'll jump into the panel.
Thanks so much, Shoshana. I'm really excited about this. I think this is the first time I've had some Twitter banter turn into an actual panel. So don't know if that tells me I need to be more careful on Twitter or log on a little bit more. But as Shoshana said, I'm Kaitlin Sullivan. I am a director of content policy at Meta, parent company of Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, etc. I've been at the company actually just about 10 years now, which I think is particularly relevant given this topic of transparency. In my first 6 months at the company, the Snowden events kind of happened, and one of the first big public discussions about government requests for information. It was more on the data side than the content removal side at the time, but kind of that interplay between government and tech companies, how it does work, how it ought to work, and with transparency really as a big answer to that. And 2013 was the year we published our first transparency report on government requests for data. We have since added transparency reports on the content moderation that we do under our own policies, and we are actually working now as part of a commitment we've made to our oversight board on better answering Neil's question on government requests for content moderation on the basis of our policies versus what we report now when they don't violate our policy. But really excited to be able to look back at the 10 years that I've seen the industry, not just Meta, but other players in the industry, really embrace transparency and use it in a really healthy way as I think a competitive edge amongst each other, kind of always pushing for who is being transparent about what and in what ways, and getting feedback from organizations and government officials about what sorts of transparency are helpful and meaningful. There are so many ways that we can share these numbers, and also for us to share as we're putting together the reports, what you talked about of some of the ways it can be hard or the decisions that we have to make about how to share this information to ensure that it's both kind of accurate and meaningful, to ensure that we're allowed to share the information, which in some cases, and going back to that original Snowden moment, we're still only allowed to share FISA court orders in ranges. We fought really hard to be able to share that itself, because when that revelation first happened, we couldn't share anything about it under the law. So some of the things that make it complicated, and I'm really excited to hear from Emma and her background here on the global scale, and from Neil and his deep expertise here as well.
Thank you so much, Kaitlin. And now over to Neil.
Great. It's so good to be here. I think this is also the first time I've turned a tweet into a panel. Well, I didn't do it. Shoshana did all the real work. But so a little bit about me. I'm Neil Chilson. I'm at Stand Together, and I do a lot of different things, but I come from the Federal Trade Commission previously. And so my focus is on a lot of things that intersect with tech policy, antitrust, privacy, content moderation, free speech online. And historically, my focus has been on what the government should do or not do in this space. The tweet I wrote with very little expertise, as it will turn out to be demonstrated soon, was about what Elon Musk should do as he takes over Twitter. And it's by far my most popular tweet, which I learned a ton of things from it. First of all, no matter if you mention Elon Musk in a tweet, you will get people who both think you're criticizing him and endorsing him, and they will both yell at you. So that's interesting. But I very quickly learned when I called for periodic reports, like the ones that platforms do for law enforcement. Let me give a little context to that particular part. I remember, and Kaitlin, I'm sure remembers this as well, in the early days of a bunch of these platforms, the way that law enforcement would interact when they were trying to investigate criminal conduct with these platforms was sometimes extremely aggressive. And I think in many ways, the Silicon Valley platforms engaged with law enforcement in a way that was more protective of the user rights eventually, right? It became cool, right? In a way to be like, hey, look, like the people who are on our platforms have civil rights. We're going to need process from you in order to deliver information about them to you. And it became, outside of the legal requirements there, it became sort of cool to do that, right? And there were disclosure reports that were not really required, but the platforms put a lot of time into that. And that seemed to be totally missing from this sort of job owning around content moderation. It was sort of the opposite. Well, I don't know if it's opposite exactly, but people didn't seem enthusiastic about disclosing that government was asking them to take down content and that they were interacting with them. And so I just thought, why is that enthusiasm gap there? And it should change. Like, how can we change that? But I very quickly found out from Kaitlin and from some other people in the threads that the platforms actually do disclosures in this space. I was completely unaware of. And so I'm really glad that we'll get a chance to hear a little bit more about what those look like. Now, I think they didn't satisfy everything that I was thinking of, but I did learn a lot of interesting things about what the platforms are trying to do as far as disclosures in this space. And I think I look forward to talking about how we can help them do better.
Thank you so much, Neil. And now over to Emma.
Great. Thank you so much, Shoshana, and to Senator Lummis for hosting us for this great discussion. I really just want to dive in and start talking with everyone about what's been raised so far, but I'll do a quick intro of myself. So my name's Emma Llansó. I'm the director of the Free Expression Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology, where I lead CDT's work in fighting for free expression, access to information online in the US, Europe, and around the world. And that looks like a lot of different things. In the US, it's a lot of legislative activity and also involvement in court cases, arguing on First Amendment grounds for users' rights to access information and speak freely online. But as Shoshana mentioned at the top of the panel, internationally, we look more to international human rights standards, but which have a lot more in common with the First Amendment than is sometimes portrayed, especially as far as people's rights to know and understand when the government is actually trying to take action to silence their speech. When I got into this work back in the late 2000s, started at CDT in 2009, this whole dynamic between governments and companies was one of the things that really drew me to this work around free expression online. This is one of the core online free speech issues going back decades. We've always had a focus on this role of intermediaries, both as potential, wonderful supporters of free expression. It's low barriers to entry to be able to post content on social media, or before that, message boards, or run your own blog, or send out a email newsletter. Online intermediaries can be great facilitators of free expression, but they can also be targets as potential failure points or kind of gatekeepers for speech that especially governments, both in the US and especially around the world, will target when they see someone speaking and they can't get that person directly, but they want to silence that person. So this dynamic around kind of the role of the intermediary and what is influencing their decisions around taking down or leaving up user speech has always been core to the conversations about free expression online. It's part of why laws limiting intermediary liability, like Section 230, are so important, because laws like Section 230 establish the clear limits of when can an intermediary actually, under the law, be held legally responsible for the content that their users are posting. But we've seen government pressure on intermediaries play out in a lot of different scenarios around the world, from extremely overt kinds of pressures, like a government blocking access to an entire website because, for example, YouTube won't take down a certain video and Pakistan blocks them entirely. We've seen governments focus on threatening or even arresting and detaining staff of companies, including in India and Russia, as a way to pressure companies into taking stronger action against user content. And we've also seen spreading kind of across Europe more formalized programs where law enforcement will contact companies about the kinds of content on their services that might violate the company's terms of service, even if it's not necessarily illegal under that country's laws, and certainly without going through any kind of court process to get that content taken down. So there are a lot of different kinds of jawboning or pressure that we've seen from governments around the world. And there's been a long call from civil society groups in the US and around the world for more transparency, both from tech companies, and we can dig into more kind of what we've seen in reports so far, and what we'd still like to see, but also transparency from the government actors themselves. And this is a place where I think especially the United States could really stand to show some leadership worldwide about being more transparent from the government's perspective about when they're actually having contact with social media companies and making these kinds of requests. So a lot to talk about. I hope we can dig into all of these issues in today's discussion, and just really excited to have this conversation.
Thank you so much, Emma. So before I begin, just one quick thing for audience participants. Our Q&A is open, so feel free to submit questions at any time. You don't have to wait for the panel to continue if you have stuff you're like burning to ask. But I want to start first by talking just about the scope of the discussion, that no matter how deep we dive into international issues, I think what Emma's saying is super important here, because we're often thinking just within a United States context, but a lot of rules we set and norms we set here can go to other places. So, you know, a lot of people might agree that that certain countries such as China and certain countries in the Middle East are oppressive in the way they treat these platforms and free speech in certain contexts. And I think most people on both the left and the right of the spectrum, even if it's different issues, can agree that government at different times has abused its power towards disfavored groups. Whether you see it as, you know, going after conservatives through the IRS or online, or you see different police abuses on the left of the spectrum, and there's overlap there too. I'm just, you know, giving certain examples. And that it's important to think about that government doesn't always use its power appropriately, and presumably we just want to know about it. Sunlight doesn't, it's a good disinfectant. It doesn't take care of everything, but at least it helps people know what's going on. So kind of coming from that perspective of more transparency, the better. Kaitlin, I want to start with you, but then afterwards, please, Neil and Emma jump in too. Why can't, let's say Meta, or it could be any platform, but you come from Meta. But you know, let's say, why can't you just disclose every single instance that a government agency reaches out or a politician reaches out? Tell me some of like the immediate barriers of like, oh man, well, here's why I can't do that.
Yeah, happy to. And if you'll allow me, I'll take a step back to talk a little bit first about what we do already disclose today, and then kind of how this is additional. And I know other folks in the panel also have a great view of folks across the industry, because everyone does this in slightly different ways. So first off, there's kind of two types of disclosure that we do. One is directly to a user whose content is affected. And the second is in these aggregate reports that we publish, where you can break things down by country and by 6-month period and look at historical trends and really nerd out, which I highly encourage everyone to do. Transparency.fb.com, really great resource to play around with all sorts of our data reports. So when it comes to disclosure for users, what we already do is notify them in almost every case when their content is removed for violating our community standards. So for violating the rules that we set for our platform that exist everywhere globally, regardless of local law. And then the second thing that we do, and this is something that we've really invested in a lot, and I've seen change a lot in my 10 years, is notify users when their content was removed or restricted because in a particular jurisdiction on the basis of a formal government report, which is generally that content violates the local law. And we are always trying to get better and more granular about what that notice is. I think we'd love that notice to be, here is exactly who, you know, requested this, under what law they did, and your process for exercising your due process to the extent it exists in your country against that. And Emma and others in the human rights space and the transparency space have really been pushing us to get better at that for a long time. We also disclose basically both of those things at the macro aggregated level. So you can go look at our transparency report for government requests for content restriction based on local law or based on things that are not our standards, where we would not have removed it under our own standards. We will always do that review first, but we are restricting it because the government has requested. Again, you can see that number broken down by country. There's a really cool heat map, and we're increasingly adding color to that. So I think I pulled up Ireland's, and it talks about how this part of Ireland's requests are for defamation, and this part were illegal goods being sold, goods that are illegal in Ireland to sell, but maybe not in other parts of the world, and so not under our policies. And we try to give as much color as we can there. And then separate to that, we have our transparency report, which is what do we do under our policy. So no matter who reports it, we're going to take down a piece of hate speech if it violates our hate speech policies, or a piece of nudity if it violates our nudity policies. You can go see all of that information, including how accurate we are at doing it, how many people appeal, and how many things we restore on mistakes. What Neil's tweet was kind of asking for, and what actually the oversight board, which is this independent body that helps to govern Facebook and also push for this transparency, is asking for is, what about the overlap between those two things? When the government sends you a request and it is because it violates your policies, or you take action on it because it violates your policies. That is something that we are working on putting together. We've kind of put out a commitment that we agree with the oversight board. We should do that. Some of the reasons why that's a little bit complicated can be in terms of knowing when a government request comes in. We have formal channels. Anyone on Facebook can also report using our tools. There have been discussions on this panel of other channels. So being able to aggregate that, being able to really organize the data in a meaningful way to share it is some of the things that make that a little bit trickier to know. And then, of course, there's some jurisdictions where we're not allowed to. We talked about FISA orders at the top of this. There are countries that give us legal orders and then have gag orders that come with those for the companies, where they cannot disclose to the user or to the public what the request was and who it was from or why. Some of those are for really important national security reasons. Some of those are for reasons that I'm sure folks on this panel would like to have kind of more scrutiny and oversight over. And then there are also interesting questions about when someone is acting, in their official capacity. Is this, if Shoshana is a Hill staffer and she had an issue logging into her account because someone hacked it and reaches out to a contact at Meta, that's probably not in her official capacity if she's reaching out on behalf of a constituent, because she's in constituent outreach and they called up their congressperson when they couldn't navigate our reporting systems, which need to be better. Is that in the official capacity? And how do we kind of make those differentiations?
Yeah, Kaitlin educated me so quickly on my Twitter thread about what Facebook was doing. And I think she's really done a good job of laying out the sort of overlap and what I was probably trying to ask for in my question. I think it's great that Meta's working on that specific overlap because for a couple of reasons. One, policies, when they are broadly applicable and maybe there's a lot of interpretation that can happen on them, it will matter a lot depending on who's reporting the content. And so that could really shift how the decisions come out. I mean, it's like if you had a speed trap where you reported everybody going above the speed limit, but you only reported a certain political party, right? Like, yeah, sure, everybody's violating the law, but like you're just picking out the ones that you want. That can have a biased effect. And so I'm glad that that's I'm glad that you guys are working on that. And I think the vagueness of it, I think as well, pushes us towards the potential vagueness of some policies pushes us towards a need for more disclosure about when government is achieving or seeking to achieve certain goals by helping the companies interpret those policies and who they apply to. So, I think it's great that the companies are moving in that direction, and I can't wait to see more of that.
And I think your point there, just really quickly too. So I think two things. One, we would maintain that we apply the policies the same way, no matter who is reporting the content. I fully understand that the point of transparency is not taking those things on faith, either from a tech company or, frankly, as we've talked about, from a government in terms of the requests that they're making. We can and should always provide some transparency there. No one needs to believe us at our word. The second thing I think you talked about is the specificity of policies. And I think that's a part of this discussion that doesn't get talked about enough. And this is maybe I get to spend my days writing and debating those policies. And if anyone's taken a look at Meta's, one of the things that I am most proud of that we've done in our transparency over the last decade is become really transparent on the very specifics of our policies so that people can understand the nuances and kind of apply them themselves and understand where we might be making mistakes or having bias and hold us accountable. But when I started, I think our policy on nudity read something along the lines of, we don't really allow nudity, but we understand that things are important like breastfeeding and statues of David. And we left it there, and it was kind of up to you to understand what that meant. And of course, no one could understand what that meant. And if you look now, again, transparency.fb.com at our policies on nudity, I think if you printed it out, just nudity alone would be well over 5 pages with very specific how much of what needs to be showing to what degree and when in order for something to come down. And I think that degree of specificity also helps, like you said, Neil, as an accountability mechanism here, because when anyone comes to us and says, I think this violates your nudity policy, we don't want them to guess at what that means. Or when we say we've taken this down for violating our nudity policy, we don't want anyone to have to guess at what that means or why. We have put out the full thing, all words, you can read it. Wouldn't recommend reading it with your grandmother looking over your shoulder. We are very explicit about what we mean for that and every other policy. And I think pushing the industry across the board, I think it benefits everyone, the more clarity we can provide to those details, as well as the numbers that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and I just wanted to chime in a little bit on both the transparent, like kind of the benefits of transparency reports that we've been talking about, and also the user notice piece. And so one thing I'd flag for folks is that actually Twitter was, I think, the first tech company to start reporting on the kind of account suspension for terms of service reasons in response to government demands back in about 2017. One of the challenges I think across the different company transparency reports is that it's not always easy to tell what the various columns and numbers in the tables that are published actually mean. So Twitter started publishing this number under a new column in their account or in their report back in 2017 called accounts toss. And if you eventually they included some explanation that was basically their way to report when a legal demand of some sort had come in, but instead of replying to it as a matter of law, the company was taking down content as a matter of their terms of service. And it's something that I've heard from a lot of different social media services and other companies, and that most of them now kind of disclose in their transparency reports, that often the first thing that a company does when they get a court order in or other kind of legal demand is look at their terms of service first, because terms of service apply globally on the platform. They're the set of rules that the company is more familiar with as far as enforcing, rather than the specific law necessarily in one of hundreds of countries around the world. And so a lot of times legal demands end up not necessarily being complied with as the company saying, we consent to the jurisdiction of this legal actor in this country and agree the interpretation of the law, and that's why we're taking this content down. It's it's like, oh, this violates our policy against such and such. This violates our nudity policy. This violates our CSAM policy or something else. And that's a dynamic that I think is really important for users to understand, because governments are getting savvier about playing on that, about figuring out that, like, because the companies have their own rights to set what their content policies are, to decide what kind of speech they will and won't host, there's often content policies that are more restrictive than what could be restricted under law, especially here in the US, but including in different parts of the world. And that can be a way for governments to use those maybe broader, or at least in certain cases more specific, rules against certain kinds of content to target content that the government wouldn't be able to pursue under law, in a constitutional or due process sort of proceeding. And so getting some light onto that and understanding how governments are trying to leverage the powerful content moderation systems that companies have developed just for their own kind of private interest and private purposes of running their services is really important. And so when you can look at a chart of how a company has responded to court orders and see, oh, okay, like 20% of the court orders from Turkey were complied with as a matter of law, but in practice, 90% of the time when a court order came in, content came down because the government was just getting good at targeting content that violates terms of service. That looks like a very different relationship between that company and that government. And that can really matter to people in that country to understand, like, my government expects when they go to this company that content will come down. That feels very different than saying like 70% of the time or 80% of the time we reject the court orders coming from this country. So I also wanted to mention just one of the reasons I was really glad to hear Kaitlin talking about notice to users, and that Meta is starting to give more notice to users about when government has been involved with content removal, because we've also seen that really start affecting people's ability, not only for their own right to free expression, but to hold their governments accountable for what they're doing. There was a case back in 2021 from the Israeli Supreme Court that laid this out really clearly. Israel has what they call their cyber unit, which is a unit that, among other things, will send referrals of content to social media services. Facebook, I think, receives the overwhelming majority of them, but also Twitter and other services, saying, the cyber unit has identified content that they think violates the company's terms of service. Activists in Israel were trying to bring legal claim against the cyber unit, not against Facebook or Twitter or any of the companies, but to say this government body is impermissibly targeting our speech because of the content of the speech. They were activists who thought that the cyber unit was trying to silence them, was trying to say, we don't agree with the perspectives or the criticism of the government or the information that you're putting on these services, and we're figuring out whatever we can do to get your speech taken down. But unfortunately, because the users in that case did not have any kind of notice or information from the companies about the fact that the report that ultimately led to the company reviewing their content and taking it down came from the cyber unit, the court said they didn't have standing. They said you can't demonstrate that the government was even involved in this company applying their terms of service against your content. And so this, I think, is a really good illustration of there are at least 3 different actors with different relationships with each other involved in all of these scenarios. And while the user and company relationship might be operating exactly as both sides expect, the company has their terms of service and the user posts something that may or may not violate it, when you start having the government come in and push on that and potentially leverage what the company's doing to go after certain speech by speakers, we need to make sure there's a way for people to hold their governments accountable for that action, regardless of what the company's doing, because otherwise we're losing that kind of key democratic control of government action that is essential to our societies.
Kaitlin, I wasn't sure if you had something. I saw you or both you and Neil unmuted. Jump in if you guys have something.
Yeah, I think if you will allow me, Shoshana, I would actually like to ask Neil and Emma a question. And Emma kind of answered this with the end of her last statement. But I think if I were to just completely take off my meta hat here and play devil's advocate, almost thinking about the position of some of these governments, I'd love to hear from both of you more about the value of the disclosure at this particular intersection when the company potentially was going to, or under some views ought to. I think there's a lot of people who have a really high expectation of these companies that if they're going to put out their terms of service, they ought to be enforcing them perfectly anyway, or trying to. And so I could see a devil's advocate question being like, well, if it if it really did violate the terms of service anyway, why does it matter whether another user reported it, a classifier proactively detected it, or the government reported it? And I think maybe said even more strongly, there could be some people who would argue, isn't it the government's job in some cases to help ensure that these companies are enforcing their terms of service? A safety commissioner in some country getting on a platform's case for not enforcing bullying violations against minors could be viewed as a really kind of good thing. So I'd love to hear from both of you how you'd respond to maybe that argument. And thank you, Shoshana, for letting me steal your hat as moderator for a second there. But we've got two really smart minds on this, and I want.
Well, you're gonna shove me right into like philosophy of law, and I already dipped my toe in it a little bit. But of course,
that may or may not be what I studied in undergraduate. So,
but of course, like the letter of the law as written down and the letter of the law enforced are really different things, and we know this in criminal law already, that you can have a law that applies to everybody, but the way it's enforced can really be discriminatory. And so I think that, treating all incoming requests for review of content as, representative or somehow not representative of a viewpoint, I think is a little bit hazardous. And at least disclosing that there is an interested party who is seeking to enforce a platform's policies against people, I think is really, really important. And one of the things that jumped out to me in, one of the great rebuttals on the Twitter thread, and that you mentioned again here, is that, well, if a government employee in their day job is using our Twitter tools to report our Meta tools to report things, like how are we supposed to distinguish that necessarily? And that literally just, as a former government employee, that made my head explode, because I was like, they probably are doing that. Like, I mean, I would be really interested to know how much that's happening, and if it's happening under official duties. And so your example was that in some countries, might it be
official duties, when might it not be official duties?
Right.
So maybe you're real reporting something.
Yeah, exactly. And so that would be really interesting to know. And like you said, it's hard. It might be hard to figure out from the platform side. And that's why so far, much of our discussion has been about sort of what the platform should do. Government can get its house in order a little better here too, right? There's plenty of things that government can do to require employees to respect the civil liberties of the citizens by not calling for their content to be taken down. And I think we could talk about a lot of those. I think there's a lot of legislative proposals, but there's a whole host of things, even everything from congressional rules to, just updating ethics for federal employees, for example. And I think that in some ways that is I'm a little biased because, like I said, I tend to think about what the government should do and shouldn't do, and less about what companies should do and shouldn't do. But I do think that there are a lot of options for government, for congressional members who are concerned about this, to push government to be much, much more transparent about these types of efforts to shape dialogue on the social media platforms.
Yep. And I just add to that, I totally understand your questions, Kaitlin, kind of from the perspective of a company that, a company is going to want whatever good information or good leads that they can get on content that might violate their policies to come in through whatever channel they can get. Sure. I care more about the user and what's happening to the actual person and their relationship with their government. And that's where I think it is, even if if, for example, Meta uses a lot of automated scanning technology as part of its content moderation system. So a lot of, I think in your reports, over 95 or 98% of the content that comes down on Meta first gets detected by Meta's own system. So we're already in a situation where Meta systems operating at, I'm sure, the best that you're able to get them to operate at, hasn't caught this content, but later a government official has gone in and targeted it. We're already in an environment where it's like, is there some additional context that's either missing from Meta's perspective on the content, or that the government official is implying or inferring about that really starts to just open up a lot of questions about what exactly is going on in this content. But especially for the user to understand that their speech is under scrutiny by their government or a foreign government, that's crucial. Setting aside anything about the operation of a particular company's content moderation systems, that is directly relevant to the health and safety and very life of that person and their family in some circumstances. So that's where I think understanding that there really are these three different actors in these scenarios, and that while it might be understandable for the company to want to use these sorts of reports as part of how they evaluate content, that's not the entirety of the interaction that's happening, and that empowering users to understand when what they have said online has caught the attention of a government official somewhere is a really crucial kind of aspect of all of this. And very much to Neil's point, this is where, and folks like Kaitlin at Meta have heard from civil society folks like me for a decade plus about, we need you all to be providing this transparency because we're not getting it from the government. We are not hearing it from the government, and that whether in the US or in other countries, and that is really problematic. It might be a bit much to expect that Russia or Turkey or China will provide that transparency, but we could expect better of the US government. We could expect better of a lot of governments around the world. And that's where, yes, we're never going to necessarily know for sure that a flag that comes in through a standard user reporting portal comes from, a government official who's sitting at home on their couch in their sweatpants on a Friday night off the clock. And that's not something that I think we can expect the company to identify and lock down and treat differently from other flags, because again, they're just not necessarily going to have that information. But there sure as heck could be rules for the place where that government official works about whether that's appropriate behavior for that official to engage in. I would be incredibly curious to know if there are US agencies that have a process of routinely flagging content either overtly or surreptitiously to social media services. As far as I know, nothing at the federal level has been publicly disclosed on that. I want to say ACLU of Northern California may have gotten some FOIA requests about LAPD doing things like this, but I expect that more of it is happening than anyone on this panel would be comfortable with. But we don't have a culture of routine transparency from government officials on that in the US. And that's something that definitely should change.
I think it's slightly tangential to that because there are also places where governments can directly moderate content on platforms. So if a congressperson has a page on Facebook or whatnot, on many platforms offer this. And I think that's also, important. It's an industry-wide conversation, but they can moderate their own comments directly. And I think some of the offices share the policies under which they do that, and some of the offices don't. And I think there are a variety of stances that the different, even kind of taking it to the micro level, the different US Congresspeople's office have on how to deal with comments on their own kind of pages or in response to their own tweets and whatnot.
Yep, and some developing First Amendment case law on that as well, of when an official has a space on a social media service, is that a public forum where they are limited in how they can suppress user speech on their little slice of Facebook or Twitter or any of these services. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's the one nuance there, I think, is that at least when that moderation happens, you might not know why, but you know who. I think the big difference if that senator or that government official goes and talks to a platform and says, hey, can you take down this content? And then indirectly, you're not quite sure why it went down. You certainly don't associate it necessarily with some sort of official action. And I think that is part of what is, to me, the biggest problem with all of this, is that when stuff like this eventually comes out, or when you see it and you experience it, it undermines trust both in the platform and in the government. And we're in a situation in this country where we definitely could use more trust in some of these institutions, not less trust. And so I do think that it's it's incumbent to increase the transparency in this space. I think in particular, the reason I think that some disclosure, at least on the government side, would be helpful is because I can tell you, as somebody who used to answer FOIA requests, the potential of transparency is a deterrent effect on government actors. And so if they know that when they make a request, it's going to be logged by the company, or it's going to be logged by their agency under some requirement, they're very careful when they make those requests. They're not just like saying, I don't know if this is that important. They prioritize, right? And so I think that is getting the incentives right on the government side is super important. And I think in the US, we have a shot at that. I take Emma's point that this is much harder in other countries that don't have some of the basic due process protections that we have, but at least in the U.S. we could do this a lot better, and I hope Congress will take up some of this.
Oh, go ahead, Kaitlin, just quick, and then I have more. It's been a great discussion too, which is why I'm like so hesitant to jump in.
Well, I was just going to say, and you let me know, Shoshana, if you want to go in a different direction, but there's an interesting question from the Q&A about what level of transparency is desired. And I think that's really interesting because some of the meaningful accountability that we're talking about, you would actually need essentially quite a high level of transparency. Are we talking about who exactly or what office did the request? Are we talking about, the reason why they're doing the request, the reason why it's removed, what level of granularity are we thinking about here would be really interesting. And then I think that also goes back again to the point that Emma was making about the two tracks of transparency, because I think it'd be interesting to hear what the ideal levels would be from a company, platform, or even government perspective. But those are probably always going to be, for reasons of necessity, abstracted to a level that they're harder to be actionable than the direct transparency to a user, where they will know a lot more about their particular circumstance and what content was affected. But it's funny. Are being shared? Is it really actionable transparency?
This is the exact way I wanted to go with it too. So I'm glad we're all on the same page here. That's funny, because there's a couple of layers here too that I want to have the audience think about kind of too in the context. I know a lot of times people are like, oh, well, why does a social media company push back more on the American government than maybe certain other governments? It might be because of a freedom level that that's a thing you do in America. You will yell at the government, and that's healthy and that's positive. And you don't get to do that in every country. And not to say, there might be an ethical reason to shut down in certain countries, but that line is sometimes, I know I'm going too far into Emma's lane, but this is part of why I think CDT's work is really interesting, because it approaches the question, these kinds of ethical questions of, how much is it worth it to comply with government before you pull out in certain cases? And then there's on the margins, how, can you disclose this? Is it worth not disclosing it if these people can have more access to democratizing tools? I think these are really hard questions that I certainly do not have the answers to, but it's something that I often think about in these terms, and that we should expect a lot of our government. If we love it, we should want it to be clean, and we should want it to do the right things. And I think with transparency, especially, that's something where we're not perfect, but we tend to have a little more opportunity. On my end, I'll just start by saying I would love to know every instance where the government requests anything. Maybe it has to pass a period of investigation or whatever, and it can't be disclosed right away, but I want to know everything. But I think Emma's point about it being most important that the user knows, that the specific user that this is happening to knows, because they're the person who can make it actionable. But I know that that platforms can't report every instance, one, because of size and detail, but two, because of national security letters. They come with gag orders, and you can't talk about them. You can't even talk about the number of those, which is crazy to me. Like, oh, the number endangers national security, which I'll admit I find a little bit dubious. But I'd love to know from each of you exactly what our anonymous person was asking. What's the desired level of transparency? One, in an ideal world, and two, according to the realistic limits that we know exist, from national security letters to privacy issues and others. And whoever wants to take it first, go for it.
Yeah, well, and I know we're running short on time, so one thing I will point folks to are the Santa Clara Principles. They're at santaclaraprinciples.org. This was a set of principles around transparency and accountability in content moderation that a whole group of civil society advocates from around the world dealing with these issues have put together. My organization was very involved in helping develop them. And one of the things we did when we updated the principles in a process running over the past couple of years was really focus on this issue of government transparency. One of the things that we call for in the Santa Clara Principles is, even just as a starting point, so maybe not the ideal scenario, Shoshana, that you're talking about, but even as a starting point, to hear from companies what are their general theories and approaches to engaging with government actors, and what are the if there are formal procedures or processes or working groups or whatever it is where they are regularly in contact with government. Disclose those, explain those, give users a sense in general of how this company interacts with government. And I think, for a company like Meta, that's not a paragraph, right? That's going to be a complicated answer with a lot of different dimensions to it. So starting to think about what does it look like to at least identify all of the multi-stakeholder working groups you're in, or the different ways that on subject matter you might approach interacting with government. Because one thing I think we should be clear, it's not always bad for government and companies to be talking to each other. There are times, whether it's like natural disasters or trying to get the best information about COVID-19 available to people, or trying to make sure accurate information about how elections are run. Often government is a really important source of information that online services are trying to help get out to people and use to inform their content moderation. And there might be things that happen not kind of for public consumption, but are more about cybersecurity threats or other kinds of real threats to the structures and the systems that the companies are running, that I think we do actually want government and company to be able to talk to each other and get that information. But it would be great to know that that is happening. Even if we as the people can't know all of the details of confidential information that's being exchanged, we should know that it's happening and know that there are some clearly articulated limits, such as, individual information about user accounts is not being shared, but general information about threats that a company is seeing on their service might be shared. Things like, even as a starting point, getting a general description of that sort of information would move us so far into the conversation and getting some of this out in the light. And on the government side, I think, as we've been talking and Neil was talking about in particular, getting agencies to articulate their policies for this sort of thing and what their approaches are, what their standards and limits are, would be an enormous step forward.
Yeah, as far as the level of transparency, that would be useful. I think I'd just say, again, the level necessary to incentivize government employees to properly weigh and balance whether or not the ask is worth the cost. And so right now it's basically costless, as far as I can tell, and that cost should go up a little bit for government agencies. But I would be remiss, as a huge fan of emergent order and bottom-up solutions, not to point out that this entire problem is because we have a quite centralized approach to content moderation, which has its benefits, but this is definitely one of its downsides. When you have a central decision maker who is choosing how content moves in a system, you're giving up a lot of the sort of local knowledge that the individuals have about the context in which they're saying things. And it's a pretty nice target for people who want to pressure a media ecosystem. And so I don't have easy answers to that. Nobody really does. But it is a direct effect of that approach of content moderation.
Yeah, I think happy to share briefly. I think it's really interesting and I really, again, encourage folks to take a look at these reports that companies put out there. They're out there, but they're only as valuable as they're used too. And I think the more that people use them and rely on them and understand them, that is, in addition to them being produced, that is actually where a lot of that leverage and friction that Neil talked about comes from. If Twitter or YouTube or Meta or whoever puts out these transparency reports and there's never a news article about them or an inquiry about them or something like that, they're not going to have that leverage. But I think you can look at them and see the variety of ways that companies are currently reporting these things as well. You know, YouTube has a huge downloadable Excel file with 8,000 rows and a bunch of you know, information, but maybe a little less digestible. We've got this big pretty map, but maybe a little, you know, we have one paragraph on what Emma wants. I think Emma is right to say the process is probably more than one paragraph long. And I can share briefly what we've committed publicly to our oversight board to share around government requests for removal under our own policies. We're going to start with number of unique requests we receive, pieces of content covered by the requests, such pieces of content removed under our policies, such pieces of content that might be locally restricted under local law. Sometimes the requests come in kind of for both and such pieces where no content is taken. I think that's a starting point. I think there's probably a lot of other information that folks would like there to add, but that's kind of our plan to start. And I think the last thing I'll say is it's really been exciting to watch the industry evolve on transparency because it truly is iterative and evolving. And I think as others have pointed out, it's not just the industry evolving, it's sometimes the government actors evolving in response to the transparency in both good ways and maybe not so good ways. And it's just really interesting to watch that play out.
Well, thank you all so much, and for even staying a little bit over with me. It's hard because there were so many questions I wanted to ask, and then you all kept answering them as I was going. And the Q&A was actually really great too. And there's so much more I wanted to get to. I didn't think that we would have so much more to get to, you know, at the end of this. But really, thank you to everyone for attending, and thank you to our panelists and the senator for speaking here. I will say though, if it were up to me, this would be like 5 hours long, and I have a million of my own questions left for everyone. But I'm really just thankful you all made time. And in the follow-up email that we'll be sending out, there will be a link to this video. In addition to, I'm going to ask the panelists for links, relevant links to the work, what they think is most important, both from their organizations and from others. I know sometimes we have like those things we love to send out, but really, thank you everyone for making time today. And yeah, I hope you learned as much as I did.
See you on Twitter.